Welcome back to Becoming Black Scholarly, conversations about identity, scholarship, and becoming. I'm your host, Fred. If this is your first time joining us, Becoming Black Scholarly is a growing community for Black, first generation, and non traditional scholars exploring identity, scholarship, and becoming. Before we get started, I want to offer a brief disclaimer. I'm not a doctoral student, professor, or admissions expert. At the time of this recording, I am someone who is actively preparing for a future doctoral journey while documenting what I'm learning along the way. This podcast is not about presenting myself as an authority on doctoral education. It is about creating the kind of space I wish had existed when I first began asking questions about becoming a scholar. Everything shared here comes from research, conversations, reflections, and my lived experiences. My goal is not to tell you what your journey should look like. My goal is to invite you into a conversation about what becoming might look like for you. In episode 1, we explored a foundational question: what is becoming Black scholarly? We talked about becoming as identity work. We talked about scholarship as something larger than degrees and credentials. And we talked about why Black scholars need spaces that center not only on achievement, but also personal and cultural journeys that make achievement possible. Today's episode builds directly on that conversation because once we begin asking who are we becoming, another question naturally follows. What should we be doing before we ever apply to a doctoral program? Most people think the doctoral journey begins with an application, a personal statement, a recommendation letter, a program search, an acceptance email. But over the last year and a half, I've become convinced that the doctoral journey begins much earlier than that. Long before the application, long before the admissions committee, long before the first class. There's another stage of the journey that rarely gets discussed. A stage where future scholars might be quietly exploring ideas, wrestling with identity, confronting self-doubt, building habits, asking bigger questions, trying to imagine who they might become. For a long time, I didn't have language for that stage. Then I realized it needed a name. I call it doctoral pre-work. In today's episode, we're going to explore what doctoral pre-work is, why it matters, why so many people overlook it, and why I believe it is one of the most important parts of doctoral journey, especially for Black men. So wherever you are in your own journey, whether you're simply curious about doctoral education, actively exploring programs, or years away from applying, I invite you to settle into this conversation because the work of becoming often begins long before anyone else can see it. When I first started seriously considering doctoral education, I assumed preparation meant gathering information. I thought preparation looked like researching schools, comparing degree options, looking at tuition, reading admissions requirements, maybe reaching out to current students. In other words, I thought preparation was mostly logistical. But something interesting happened as I spent more time exploring the possibility of a doctorate. I found myself doing work that had nothing to do with the application. I was journaling, reflecting on my life experiences, thinking about the questions that seemed to follow me from one season of life to the next, reading books that wasn't assigned, listening to conversations about scholarship, paying attention to what subjects continue to capture my attention, trying to understand why certain topics felt important to me while others didn't. At first, I didn't think of any of this as doctoral preparation. I just thought I was thinking. I just thought I was exploring. But looking back, I realized something important was happening. I wasn't preparing an application, I was preparing myself. And that's when I began to understand the idea of doctoral pre-work. Doctoral pre-work is the intentional period of identity formation, topic exploration, emotional preparation, and life structuring that happens before you apply to a doctoral program. It's the work that happens before the official work, the invisible preparation that often determines how someone experiences the journey once they get there. For me, doctoral pre-work rests on 4 interconnected pillars: identity work, emotional work, intellectual work, and cultural work. Let's talk about each one. The first pillar is identity work. In many ways, this is where everything begins. Before you apply to a doctoral program, before you choose a research topic, before you write a statement of purpose, there is a more fundamental question: who am I becoming? Notice I didn't ask what degree you're pursuing. I asked who you're becoming. Because doctoral education doesn't simply change what you know, it changes how you think. how you communicate, how you see yourself, how you see others. The deeper question is whether a doctorate aligns with the person you're trying to become. For me, the question became increasingly important. I had to ask myself why I wanted this path. Was it about achievement, recognition, status, or was it something deeper? The more I reflected, the more I realized that scholarship had become a part of my identity long before I ever submitted an application. I found myself reading because I was curious, writing because I wanted understanding, researching because I had questions that mattered to me. That's identity work. Identity work asks, what kind of scholar do I want to become? What values will guide my work? What experiences shape how I understand the world? How does my lived experiences influence the questions I ask? For Black scholars, those questions carry additional weight. Our experiences are not separate from our scholarship. They often become part of the lens through which we understand the world. Identity work helps us understand that lens before we enter doctoral spaces. The second pillar is emotional work. And honestly, this is the pillar I think receives the least attention. People love talking about grades, programs, funding, research interests. Very few people talk about the emotional realities of doctoral education, the self doubt, the uncertainty, the vulnerability that comes with entering spaces where you may feel outnumbered or inexperienced. The reality is that becoming a scholar requires emotional growth. You have to learn how to sit with not knowing. You have to learn how to receive feedback without viewing it as a personal attack. You have to learn how to stay committed even when progress feels slow. You have to confront and posture feelings. And for many first generation and Black scholars, there's another layer. You may be attempting something that very few people around you have experienced. You may not have a roadmap. You may not have examples nearby. You may be carrying the weight of being the first. That emotional reality deserves attention long before the first day of class. Doctoral pre-work gives you space to begin building resilience before the pressure arrives. The third pillar is an intellectual work. This is the pillar most people recognize, but I think we often misunderstand it. Many people believe intellectual preparation means finding a dissertation topic immediately. I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal is curiosity. The goal is learning how scholars think, learning how research works, learning the language of scholarship, learning how knowledge is created. For example, intellectual pre-work might include reading dissertations, exploring journal articles, watching dissertation defenses online, learning the difference between qualitative and quantitative research, becoming familiar with academic conversations. The goal is not to have all the answers. The goal is to develop a deeper relationship with questions. In many ways, doctoral education is less about expertise and more about sustained curiosity. Intellectual pre-work helps cultivate that curiosity before formal coursework. The fourth pillar is cultural work, and for Black men pursuing doctoral education, this pillar matters tremendously. Academic spaces have cultures, they have norms, expectations, unwritten rules, assumptions, and not everyone enters those spaces with equal access to that knowledge. Part of doctoral work is learning about the cultures you're preparing to enter, understanding the hidden curriculums, learning how mentorship works, recognizing gatekeeping when it appears, learning how to advocate for yourself, building community before you need community, finding people who can help you navigate spaces that may feel unfamiliar. For Black men, cultural work also means understanding that we often enter institutions that were not originally designed with us in mind. That reality doesn't mean we don't belong. It means we need preparation, awareness, community, and strategy. The more intentional we are about that preparation, the stronger our foundation becomes. When I look back on my own journey, I realized I was engaging in all four of these pillars long before I had language for them. I was doing identity work, emotional work, and intellectual work, and cultural work. I just didn't know what to call them. Now I do. I call it doctoral pre work. And once you can see it, you begin to realize just how much of the doctoral journey actually began before the application ever gets submitted. Now that we've defined doctoral pre work and explored its four pillars, a reasonable question emerges. If this work is so important, why don't we talk about it more? Why isn't doctoral pre work a common part of the conversation about doctoral education? Why do so many aspiring scholars feel like they are figuring it out alone? I think the answer is simple. Most of the work happens where nobody can see it. And in a culture that often celebrates visible achievements, invisible work tends to go unnoticed. One reason doctoral pre-work remains invisible is because academic culture tends to reward outcomes, applications, admissions, publications, dissertations, graduations. Those milestones matter. They're important. They're worth celebrating, but they are also the visible part of a much longer process. What we rarely see are the months or years of preparation that comes before them. The late night readings, the self doubt, the reflection, the topic explorations, the difficult conversations, the personal growth, the moments when someone questions whether they belong, the moment when they decide to keep going anyway. Those experiences rarely appear on resumes, but they are often the foundation beneath every visible achievement. Another reason doctoral pre work remains invisible is because many people simply don't have language for what they're experiencing. When I was first exploring doctoral education, I didn't wake up one day and say, "Today I'm doing doctoral pre work." I thought I was researching, reading, thinking, reflecting, trying to make decisions. Only later did I realize that all of those activities were connected. Only later did I realize that they represented a distinct phase of the journey. Many aspiring scholars are already doing doctoral pre work, they just don't know what to call it. And when something doesn't have a name, it often becomes difficult to recognize the value. For many first generation scholars and Black scholars, the invisibility runs even deeper. If no one around you has completed a doctorate, there may be nobody explaining what the preparation looks like, nobody telling you which questions to ask, nobody helping you to understand what the journey requires, nobody affirming that your uncertainty is normal. And as a result, many people begin the process in isolation. They're trying to understand programs, academia, and themselves all at the same time. And because much of the work happens privately, it rarely becomes a part of public conversation. This is something I've thought about a lot. When someone gets accepted into a doctoral program, we celebrate the acceptance, and we should. That's a meaningful accomplishment. But social media often compresses years into a single moment. We see the acceptance, but we don't see the years of questioning. We see the announcement, but we don't see the preparation. We see the distinction, but we don't see the becoming. And because we don't see it, we sometimes assume it didn't happen. But by the time someone posts their acceptance letter, they've often already completed months or even years of invisible labor. Identity work, emotional work, intellectual work, cultural work. We just rarely call it that. Perhaps the biggest reason doctoral pre-work remains invisible is because most people assume the journey began when the application process begins. That's the official starting point. That's when deadlines appear. That's when requirements become concrete. Institutions begin paying attention. But institutional timelines and personal timelines are not always the same thing. The institution may recognize the beginning of your journey when you submit an application, but your becoming likely started long before then. It may have started with a question, a book, a conversation, frustrations, curiosity, a desire to understand something more deeply. Those moments matter. They are often the earliest signs of scholarly development. One of the reasons I wanted to create this framework is because I believe naming something gives people permission to recognize it. When we name doctoral pre-work, we acknowledge that preparation is part of the journey. We acknowledge that growth is happening even before enrollment. We acknowledge that becoming matters. And perhaps most importantly, we acknowledge that many aspiring scholars are further along than they realize. If you've been asking questions, reading books, exploring ideas, reflecting on future, building habits, seeking community, trying to understand your purpose, you may have already been doing doctoral pre-work. You may have already been becoming. The challenge is that most of the work happens quietly. The gift is that quiet work still counts, even when nobody else can see it. Now that we've talked about what doctoral pre-work is and why it's often invisible, let's talk about what happens when it gets skipped. And before I go any further, I want to be clear about something. There's no perfect preparation. There's no checklist that guarantees success, and there's no amount of pre-work that completely eliminates the challenges of doctoral education. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I am suggesting is that preparation changes how you experience the journey. Doctoral pre-work doesn't guarantee success, but skipping it can dramatically increase the cost of the journey. Think about it this way. If you're preparing to run a marathon, nobody is expecting you to wake up one morning and simply decide to run 26.2 miles. You will train, you will learn about pacing, you will build endurance, you will test nutrition, you will figure out what works for your body. The race itself is not the beginning of the journey, it's the public expression of preparation that happens beforehand. I think doctoral education works much the same way. The application is visible, the acceptance letter is visible, the graduation photo is visible, but the preparation work that supports this moment often remains hidden. And when the preparation doesn't happen, the consequences eventually show up. One of the first risks is choosing a program that doesn't align with your goals. When people rush towards a doctorate without doing the deeper identity work, it's easy to focus on the surface level factors: the school's reputation, the convenience, the degree title, the excitement of getting accepted. Those things matter, but they aren't everything. Without clarity about who you're becoming and why you're pursuing the degree, you may find yourself in a program that looks right on paper but feels wrong in practice. A doctorate is too large of a commitment to build on vague intentions. The clearer your purpose becomes, the easier it becomes to identify programs that genuinely fit your goals. Another risk is selecting a research area that sounds interesting but doesn't have enough meaning to sustain years of work. One of the lessons I've learned through my own exploration is that curiosity and commitment are not the same thing. Lots of topics are interesting, but far fewer are capable of holding your attention through years of reading, writing, and revising and questioning. Doctoral work requires sustained engagement. The topic has to matter, not just academically, but personally, culturally, and intellectually. Sometimes people choose topics based on trends, or because they think a topic sounds impressive, or because someone suggested it. But when challenges emerge, and they inevitably do, the absence of genuine connection becomes difficult to ignore. Doctoral pre-works help you explore ideas before you're required to commit to one. It creates room for discovery before pressure enters the process. Another consequence is emotional exhaustion. Many people prepare academically for doctoral education, far fewer prepare emotionally. They understand the coursework, but they underestimate the emotional demands, the critique, the uncertainty, the constant feeling that there's always more to learn, the pressure to perform, the tension between life responsibilities and the academic expectation. Without emotional preparation, normal challenges can feel like signs that you don't belong. Every difficult semester feels personal. Every piece of feedback feels devastating. Every setback feels like proof that you made a mistake. Doctoral pre-work doesn't eliminate those experiences, but it helps you to recognize them as part of the journey rather than evidence that you're incapable of completing it. One thing I've heard repeatedly from doctoral students is that the first year can feel disorienting. You're learning new expectations, new languages and systems, new ways of thinking. Many students arrive and assume they know what doctoral education will be. Then reality changes those assumptions. The students who have spent time exploring cultures of doctoral education often navigate the transition differently, not because they're smarter or more talented, but because they've already begun adjusting their expectations. They understand that confusion is normal, that growth feels uncomfortable, and that they understand that becoming a scholar is a process rather than an event. Another challenge is entering doctoral spaces without understanding how those spaces function. Every institution has a culture, every academic discipline has norms. There are expectations that rarely appear in official documents. There are relationships that matter. There are unwritten rules. There are hidden assumptions. And for first generation scholars and Black scholars especially, learning those norms can take time. Doctoral pre-work creates opportunities to learn before the stakes become higher. Through conversations, mentorship, observations, community, you can learn how academic spaces operate before you're fully immersed in them. This may be the most important consequence of all. Without a strong scholarly identity, it becomes easier for institutions to define your purpose for you. You begin responding to expectations rather than acting from convictions. You chase approval rather than pursuing meaningful questions. You adapt to every external pressure because you haven't yet developed an internal compass. But when you spend time doing identity work, something different happens. You enter doctoral education with a strong sense of self. You know why you're there. You know what matters to you. You know the kinds of questions you want to explore. You know the value you want to carry into your work. The institution can shape your growth, but it doesn't have to define your purpose. When people hear the phrase doctoral pre-work, they sometimes assume I'm talking about getting ahead academically. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about alignment. Alignment between your identity and your goals, your interests and your research, between your values and your academic journey. The purpose of doctoral pre-work is not perfection, it's preparation. It's giving yourself the opportunity to enter the journey with great clarity, great self-awareness, and great resilience. Because the reality is this: the doctorate will shape you. The question is whether you're spent enough time shaping yourself first. And that's why doctoral pre work matters. At this point, you might be listening and thinking, okay, I understand why doctoral pre work matters, but what does it actually look like? And that's an important question. Because when people hear the phrase doctoral pre work, they sometimes imagine something formal. They imagine special courses, expensive certifications, complex academic projects, some kind of special preparation process that only certain people know about. But most doctoral pre work is surprisingly ordinary. In fact, many people are already doing it without realizing it. The difference is that now we're giving it a name, we're recognizing it as part of the journey. Let's talk about what doctoral pre work can actually look like in everyday life. One of the simplest forms of doctoral pre-work is reflection. Not reflection about where you're applying, but reflection about who you're becoming. More questions keep showing up in your life. What experiences continue to shape the way you see the world? What problems do you care about? What communities do you feel called to serve? What kind of impact do you want your work to have? These aren't applications questions, they're identity questions. And the clearer you become about your identity, the easier it becomes to make decisions about everything else. Some of the most important preparation happens with a notebook, a quiet room, and enough honesty to explore your own thinking. We live in a time when so much information is publicly available. You can watch dissertation defenses online, listen to scholars discuss their research, attend webinars, watch conference presentations, listen to academic podcasts. Years ago, many of these spaces felt inaccessible. Today, they're often just a few clicks away. Watching these conversations help demystify academia. You begin to realize that scholars are people, thoughtful and curious people, but people. And that realization matters because many aspiring scholars spend years placing academia on a pedestal. Exposure helps make those feel more attainable. Another form of doctoral pre-work is exploring programs long before you're ready to apply. Reading handbooks, looking at course sequences, reviewing faculty profiles, examining dissertation titles, learning how programs are structured, noticing the kinds of research being produced. This isn't just choosing a program tomorrow. It's about becoming a informed future applicant. The more familiar you become with doctoral education, the less intimidating it feels. Knowledge reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is often what keeps people from moving forward. One of the most valuable things you can do is to talk to people who are already on the journey. Talk to current doctoral students or recent graduates and faculty members or researchers, people who can help you understand what the experience actually feels like. Not the polished version, but the actual version. Ask them what surprised them. Talk to them about what they wish they had known and what they struggled with. Ask them what helped them to succeed. These conversations often help provide insight that the handbook can't offer. Another form of doctoral pre-work is writing. Not perfect writing, not publication level writing, just writing. Writing helps clarify thinking. It helps you organize ideas. It helps you develop your voice. And perhaps most importantly, it helps you become comfortable with expressing your perspective. You don't need a journal publication to begin thinking like a scholar. You can write reflections, essays, book notes, research summaries, topic explorations. The goal isn't perfection, the goal is practice. Many aspiring doctoral students focus on applications while overlooking the simpler questions. Can I consistently engage in ideas? Scholarship is built on reading, not just reading for information, but reading for understanding, analysis, and connection. Building a reading habit before entering a doctoral program creates a foundation that will serve you for years. Start small, read consistently, develop curiosity. The habit matters more than the value. One of the mistakes people make is believing they must identify a dissertation topic immediately. I don't think that's necessary. In fact, I think exploration is one of the gifts of doctoral pre-work. Read broadly, follow your curiosity, allow yourself to be interested in multiple ideas. Pay attention to the reoccurring themes. Notice what continues to draw your attention. The goal isn't to force a research question. The goal is to discover what genuinely matters to you. Over time, patterns will begin to emerge, and those patterns often point towards future scholar interest. This might be the most overlooked form of doctoral pre-work. Learn how to rest, learn how to regulate your nervous system, learn how to recover, how to maintain your well-being. Because doctoral education doesn't just challenge your intellect, it challenges your capacity, your energy, and your focus, your emotional regulation, your ability to sustain effort over long periods of time. Many people enter doctoral programs believing that success is about pushing harder, but sustainable success often depends on recovery. It depends on knowing how to slow down without losing momentum. It depends on understanding that rest is not about opposite. It depends on understanding that rest is not the opposite of productivity. Sometimes rest is what makes productivity possible. Everything we've discussed so far applies to many aspiring scholars. Identity work, emotional preparation, intellectual curiosity, understanding academic cultures. These are important to anyone considering doctoral education. But I believe doctoral pre-work carries particular significance to Black men. And to understand why, we have to start with a simple reality. For many of us, pursuing a doctorate is not just an academic decision, it's also a cultural experience, an identity experience, sometimes even a generational experience. Because many Black men enter doctoral spaces carrying more than just a research interest. We carry stories, expectations, responsibilities, family histories. We carry experiences that shape how we understand ourselves and the world around us, and we and all that enters the room with us. One of the realities of doctoral education is that many Black men find themselves as one of only a few people who look like them in an academic space. Sometimes the only one. The only Black man in a classroom, the only one in a research group or a cohort, the only Black man at a conference table. That experience can be isolating if you're not prepared for it. Not because you don't belong, but because belonging and representation are not always the same thing. You can belong somewhere and still feel alone. That's why community matters before enrollment. That's why mentorship matters before enrollment. That's why doctoral pre-work matters before enrollment. Because preparation helps reduce the shock of entering unfamiliar environments. For some Black men, earning a doctorate means becoming the first in the family or community, the first among siblings or cousins, the first among people who share your background. While becoming the first can be meaningful, it can also feel very heavy. When you're the first, there isn't always a roadmap. There aren't always examples nearby. Sometimes you're creating the path while walking it. That reality requires more than academic preparation. It requires emotional preparation. You have to develop the ability to carry expectations without being crushed by them. To honor your community without feeling responsible for representing every Black person who comes after you. To pursue excellence without attaching your entire worth to achievement. Those are identity questions, and identity questions deserve attention before doctoral coursework begins. Another reality many Black men encounter is hypervisibility, being noticed more, being scrutinized more, feeling pressures to prove competence repeatedly, feeling pressure to avoid mistakes, feeling pressure to represent an entire group. Those experiences don't happen in every environment, but they happen often enough that they deserve acknowledgement. One of the benefits of doctoral pre-work is that it helps build self-awareness before those moments occur. When you know who you are, external perceptions have less power to define you. When your identity is grounded, you're less likely to let stereotypes determine your sense of belonging. When your purpose is clear, you become less dependent on external validation. That doesn't eliminate challenges, but it strengthens your ability to navigate them. This may be one of the most important distinctions of all. Many Black men are not simply preparing for doctoral education, we're simultaneously preparing for new. This may be one of the most important distinctions of all. Many Black men are not simply preparing for doctoral education, we're simultaneously preparing for a new version of ourselves. We're asking questions about careers, purpose, leadership, service, legacy, family, community, contribution. We're not just asking, what do we want to study? We're also asking, who do we want to become? Those questions often unfold together. And that means doctoral preparation becomes larger than academics. It becomes a process of personal transformation. That's one of the reasons I created Becoming Black Scholarly, because I realized there were countless conversations about admissions requirements, application strategies, but there were far fewer conversations about identity, about becoming, about the inner work that happens alongside the academic work. One of the lessons I've learned throughout my own journey is that community matters earlier than many people realize. Many aspiring scholars think they need community once they start a doctoral program. I would argue they need community long before then. You need people who understand the journey, people who can answer questions, people who can offer perspectives, who can remind you that you're not alone, people who can celebrate your growth before there is a degree to celebrate. Community provides more information, it provides encouragement, accountability, a belonging. And for Black men, belonging is often one of the most important resources we can cultivate before entering academic spaces. I often think of doctoral pre-work as a form of preparation that cannot be measured on an application. No admissions committee will ask how much identity work was done. No recommendation letter will quantify emotional growth. No transcript will show the hours you spent reflecting, reading, exploring, and preparing. But those things matter. They matter because they shape how you enter the journey. Black men don't just enter doctoral programs. We enter systems, cultures, and institutions. And sometimes we enter spaces that were not originally built with us in mind. Doctoral pre-work is not about entering those spaces with fear. It's about entering those spaces with awareness, confidence, community, and purpose, with a strong sense of who we are and who we're becoming. In other words, it's how we enter with power. And when we enter with power, we are far more capable of becoming the scholars we were always meant to be. As we begin to close today's conversation, I want to return to a simple idea. The doctoral journey does not begin with the application, it begins with becoming. And that's really what this entire episode has been about. Not the application, admissions, or dissertation, becoming. Today, we define doctoral pre-work as the intentional period of identity formation, emotional preparation, intellectual exploration, and cultural understanding that happens before someone applies for a doctoral program. We talked about why that work is often invisible, why it rarely receives recognition, and why social media tends to celebrate milestones while overlooking the years of preparation that made those milestones possible. We talked about what happens when pre-work gets skipped, how misalignment can lead to confusion, how a lack of preparation can create unnecessary struggles, how clarity often matters more than speed. We explore practical examples of what doctoral pre-work looks like in everyday life, the journaling, the reading, the conversations, the reflections, the slow and often unglamorous work of becoming. And finally, we talked about why this preparation is especially important for Black men, why identity matters, community matters, clarity matters, and why preparation matters. But perhaps the most important thing I hope you take away from today's episode is this. Doctoral pre-work is not a waiting room. It is not the space before the journey. It's part of the journey. The reading is part of the journey, the reflection is part of the journey, as well as the uncertainty is part of the journey, the questioning is part of the journey, the becoming is part of the journey. And far too often we treat preparation as if it doesn't count, as if nothing meaningful is happening until we receive an acceptance letter. But that simply isn't true. Some of the most important transformations happen before anyone knows they're happening. And that's exactly why I wanted this conversation to be one of the foundational episodes of Becoming Black Scholarly, because everything else we discussed this season builds on this idea. Over the coming episodes, we're going to explore scholar identity more deeply. We're going to talk about discovering and refining research interests. We're going to discuss emotional readiness and resilience, exploring community, mentorship, and building on scholarly ecosystems. We're going to talk about organizing ideas through systems like the three-layer memo system. We're going to talk about preparing your life, not just your application, for doctoral education. And we're going to examine some of the lessons I wish I had understood earlier in my own journey. The degree may come later, the title may come later, the acceptance letter may come later, but the becoming starts now. If you're listening to this episode, there is a good chance that your becoming has already started. Maybe you're reading more, maybe you're asking bigger questions, maybe you're exploring topics that won't leave you alone, maybe you're imagining a future that looks different from your past. Maybe you're trying to understand whether doctoral education is even the right path for you. All of that counts, all of that matters, all of that is part of the work. So before we end today's episode, I want to leave you with two questions. Not application questions, not academic questions, two identity questions. What part of the doctoral pre-work are you in right now? And perhaps even more importantly, who are you becoming? Spend some time with these questions this week. Journal about them, talk about them, reflect on them, pay attention to what emerges. Because the answers may tell you more about your future scholarly journey than any admissions requirements ever can. Thank you for spending some time with me today. If this conversation resonated with you, consider sharing it with another aspiring scholar, especially another Black man who may be navigating this journey in silence. Also share your thoughts and comments with me via email at becomingblackscholarly@gmail.com or leave a voicemail or send a text message to 704-594-1122. In the next episode, we'll continue the conversation as we dive deeper into why identity matters before enrollment. Until next time, continue reading, continue reflecting, continue asking questions, continue becoming. And join the conversation via Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at Becoming Black Scholarly. Until I'll see you in the next episode.